In the spring of 1842, a government commissioner sat in a coal mine in Yorkshire and took testimony from a young worker named Isabella Reed. She was 12 years old. Her job was to sit for 12 hours a day in a narrow underground tunnel, alone in the darkness, opening and closing a heavy wooden door whenever she heard the rattle of coal wagons approaching. She told the commissioner she had been doing this work since she was 7. She had never learned to read or write. She had never seen the sun during a working day, and when asked if she was afraid of the dark, she reportedly said she had forgotten what light looked like. Isabella was not an exception. She was the rule. The Victorian child labour system was not a hidden crime or a secret economy. It was the open, widely accepted, economically essential engine of British industrialisation. Between the 1830s and the 1880s, hundreds of thousands of children, some as young as 4 years old, formed the backbone of the nation's workforce. They worked not because their parents were uniquely cruel, but because the industrial economy demanded their small bodies, their cheap labour, and their compliance. And for the first half of the Victorian era, Parliament, factory owners, and most middle-class families accepted this as simply how the world worked. To understand the brutal reality of this system, one must first understand the scale of it. In 1840, approximately 20% of all children in London had any form of schooling. The other 80% were working. Across the industrial north, in cities like Manchester, Leeds, and Bradford, children made up nearly a third of the workforce in textile factories. In the coal fields of Lancashire and Yorkshire, boys as young as 5 were employed underground. In the potteries of Staffordshire, children as young as 6 were employed as mould runners, carrying heavy clay pieces between workbenches. And in the chimneys of nearly every town in Britain, climbing boys, often orphans sold into apprenticeship by workhouses, were forced to shimmy up flues still hot from morning fires. The economic logic was brutal but simple. Children were cheaper than adults. A male adult textile worker in the 1830s might earn 12 shillings a week. A child doing the same job might earn 1 or 2 shillings. In some industries, particularly silk weaving and matchmaking, children were paid as little as 15 shillings per year, often in board and lodging rather than cash. Employers calculated that a child could perform repetitive tasks with sufficient speed, required no living wage, and was far less likely to organize for better conditions. For struggling working-class families, the calculation was equally stark. A family could not survive on a father's wages alone. The average Manchester weaver's family in the 1830s needed at least 2 children working full-time just to keep bread on the table. Parents who sent their children to the mills were not villains. They were survivors. The day began early. In textile districts, children were expected at the factory gate by 5 in the morning. The Factory Act of 1833 had technically prohibited the employment of children under 9 in most textile mills, but enforcement was laughably weak. Only 4 factory inspectors were appointed to cover all of England. 4 men to inspect thousands of mills. Owners knew weeks in advance when an inspector was due, and children who were too young were simply hidden in closets or sent to work in upstairs rooms with warning bells installed to signal an inspection. Even when inspectors found violations, local magistrates, who were often themselves factory owners or mill shareholders, routinely dismissed cases or imposed trivial fines that owners treated as a minor operating expense. For those children who did work legally, the hours were punishing. Before the 1847 Factory Act, which finally established a 10-hour day for women and young persons, children aged 9 to 13 could be legally worked for 9 hours a day with no limit on overtime. In practice, this meant children often worked 12, 14, even 16 hours in a single shift. A witness before the Royal Commission on Employment of Children described a typical day for a child in a Leicester textile mill. Started at 5 in the morning, worked until noon with a 40-minute break for a meal of bread and weak tea, then resumed work until 9 at night. 6 days a week. Sunday was the only day off, though many children also attended church or, if they were workhouse apprentices, spent Sunday performing additional chores. The physical toll was catastrophic. Children working in factories stood for their entire shift on bare wooden floors, often in rooms with no ventilation and lit only by gas lamps that consumed oxygen and filled the air with fumes. Their small hands and fingers were ideal for threading broken cotton threads on spinning mules, but those same hands were routinely crushed or severed when machines were not stopped before repairs. The Factory Act of 1844 made it illegal for children to clean moving machinery, but again, enforcement was nearly impossible. A child who stopped a machine to clean it lost production time. An owner who stopped production lost money. So children climbed into the gears and belts while the machines ran, and every year hundreds were pulled into the mechanisms, their arms broken, their scalps torn off, their bodies crushed beyond recognition. But factories were only part of the story. The mines were worse. In 1842, the Royal Commission on Children's Employment in Mines and Factories published a report that so horrified the British public that Parliament passed the Mines and Collieries Act within months. The report documented what had been common knowledge in mining districts for decades. Children as young as 4 were employed underground. Their job titles told the story. Trappers sat alone in the dark, opening and closing ventilation doors for 12 to 14 hours at a time. They were not allowed to speak, whistle, or sing because noise could mask the sound of approaching coal wagons. They were not allowed to sleep because a closed door could kill miners by starving them of air. They simply sat in the black silence, hour after hour, day after day, from the age of 5 until they were old enough to move to heavier work. That heavier work belonged to the hurriers. These were children, both boys and girls, who dragged loaded coal wagons through passages so low that an adult could not stand upright. The wagons, called corves, weighed up to 300 pounds when full. A hurrier crawled on hands and knees, a leather belt around their waist attached to the cart by a chain. They pulled for shifts of 12 hours or more, their knees and palms raw and bleeding through the shift. The girls worked alongside the boys, often naked from the waist up because the tunnels were so hot and cramped that clothing would catch on the rock walls. When the commission asked one witness why girls were employed in such conditions, the mine owner replied simply that they were cheaper and worked harder. The health consequences of mine work were immediate and irreversible. Children who started in the pits at 5 rarely lived past 25. The coal dust destroyed their lungs from the first day, producing a condition miners called black spit, a chronic cough that expelled mucus stained with coal particles. By age 12, most hurriers had visible deformities in their knees, spines, and shoulders from years of crawling in unnatural postures. By age 15, many could no longer crawl at all and were simply dismissed, replaced by the next generation of 5-year-olds. The commissioners asked one boy how long he had worked in the mine. He said 7 years. They asked how old he was. He did not know. Above ground, other industries produced their own unique horrors. In the match factories of East London, children, mostly girls, worked from 6:30 in the morning until 7 at night in rooms thick with yellow phosphorus fumes. The girls stood all day, dipping matchsticks into chemical baths, their fingers stained yellow, their hair falling out, their jaws aching. The aching was the first symptom of phosphorus necrosis, a disease the match girls called phossy jaw. The phosphorus in the fumes accumulated in the jawbone, causing abscesses, swelling, and eventually a greenish-white glow from the dying bone. Surgeons treated the condition by removing the entire lower jaw. Many girls died on the operating table. Those who survived could no longer eat solid food. The condition was so closely associated with matchmaking that when doctors saw it, they did not need to ask the patient's profession. In the hat-making trades, children were exposed to mercury, used to treat felt for top hats. The mercury vapors attacked the nervous system, causing tremors, slurred speech, paranoia, and hallucinations. The phrase "mad as a hatter" was not a figure of speech. It was a clinical diagnosis. In the potteries, children worked as mold runners, carrying heavy clay between stations while breathing in silica dust that scarred their lungs so badly that coroners could identify a potter's lung from across the room. In the textile bleaching works, children stood ankle-deep in chemical vats, their skin burned by chlorine and lime. And everywhere, always, the hours were long, the pay was pitiful, and the threat of death or permanent injury hung over every shift. Perhaps the most infamous child labor occupation, and the one that has become the symbol of Victorian cruelty, was the climbing boy. Chimney sweeps employed young boys, some as young as 4, to crawl up chimney flues and brush loose the soot. The flues were narrow, often only 9 inches by 14 inches, and could be over 100 feet long in the great chimneys of factories and grand houses. The boys climbed using their knees, elbows, and back, scraping themselves raw on rough brickwork. They worked naked to reduce friction, and their masters often rubbed their skin with brine to toughen it, a process so painful that boys would scream and try to run away. Masters kept their boys in line with threats and violence. If a boy climbed too slowly, the master would light a fire of straw or damp wood in the fireplace below, the smoke and heat driving the boy upward in terror. If a boy got stuck halfway up the flue, the master had few options. Sometimes a second boy was sent up to push or pull the first one loose, and sometimes both became trapped. When that happened, the master would simply break through the wall to retrieve the bodies or, in some documented cases, leave them to die. The narrowness of the flues meant that a stuck boy could not turn around to come down. He had to go up or die trying. The long-term health effects were appalling. In addition to the joint damage and scarring, climbing boys suffered from chimney sweeps cancer, a squamous cell carcinoma of the scrotum caused by years of soot lodging in the folds of their skin. The London surgeon Percival Pott identified this cancer in 1775, making it the first occupational cancer ever described in medical literature. He noted that chimney sweeps often developed the disease in their 20s and 30s, and that by the time they sought treatment, the cancer had usually spread to the abdomen and was invariably fatal. Despite Pott's discovery, climbing boys continued to work for another century because the demand for clean chimneys outweighed any concern for their lives. The movement to regulate child labor did not begin from humanitarian idealism. It began from political calculation and public disgust. The early Factory Acts, the Cotton Mills Act of 1819 and the Factory Act of 1833, were passed not because Parliament suddenly loved children, but because middle-class reformers feared that the industrial system was producing a generation of physically broken, morally degraded, and potentially revolutionary workers. Lord Ashley, later the Earl of Shaftesbury, led the parliamentary fight for child labour restrictions not as a radical but as a Tory paternalist who believed that unfettered capitalism was destroying the social fabric. He and his allies assembled evidence, interviewed workers, published reports, and shamed factory owners. They were opposed at every step by manufacturers who argued that restrictions would destroy British industry and throw families into deeper poverty. The Factory Act of 1833 was a compromise. It banned employment of children under 9 in textile mills, limited children 9 to 13 to 9 hours a day, and required 2 hours of schooling, but it applied only to textile factories. It did not cover mines, potteries, brickworks, match factories, or chimney sweeps. It was enforced by 4 inspectors for the entire country, and it contained a fatal exception for silk mills, where children could still work 10 hours a day from age 9 with no schooling required because silk manufacturers successfully lobbied that their industry was uniquely fragile and would collapse if forced to comply. The 1842 Mines and Collieries Act was more effective, banning all females and boys under 10 from underground work. But enforcement was again weak, and in many mining districts, owners simply shifted children to surface jobs like sorting coal, a task that involved sitting for 12 hours a day over a moving conveyor belt, picking out pieces of stone and slate with bare hands. The work was above ground, but the conditions were still brutal. The coal dust still filled their lungs. The sharp edges still cut their fingers. And the hours were still long. The 1844 Factory Act established the first real health and safety standards, requiring that dangerous machinery be fenced and forbidding children from cleaning moving machines. It also introduced the half-time system, under which children under 13 worked half a day and attended school for half a day. In theory, this was progress. In practice, the schooling was often a sham. Half-time schools were held in damp basements or abandoned warehouses, taught by exhausted workers or illiterate former miners, and attended by children who were so tired from their shift that they fell asleep at their desks. Inspectors reported finding half-timers who had attended school for 2 years but still could not write their own names. The turning point came in 1878 with the Factory and Workshop Act, which consolidated all previous legislation and extended protections to most industries, including previously exempt trades like brickmaking and bleaching. The 1878 Act set a universal minimum age of 10 for employment, limited children to half-day work and half-day schooling until 14, and finally brought silk mills under the same rules as other textiles. It was not a humanitarian triumph. It was a bureaucratic rationalization. But for the children who no longer started work at age 4, who no longer worked 16-hour shifts, who no longer cleaned moving machines with their fingers, it mattered. Even after 1878, enforcement remained uneven. In 1883, a royal commission in Victoria, Australia, which was then a British colony, heard testimony that in Melbourne printing works, boys of the most tender years were working from 3 or 4 in the afternoon until 3 in the morning, breathing air filled with gas fumes. The Victorian Parliament passed a Factory Act in 1885 that was actually more protective than British law, requiring medical inspections and stricter age verification. But Australia was the exception. In Britain, well into the 1890s, children still worked in glass factories where furnace temperatures caused heat stroke and dehydration. They still worked in laundries where steam burns were routine. They still worked in agriculture from dawn to dusk, their small hands picking hops or harvesting turnips alongside adults. The last climbing boy died in 1900. By then, the system that had consumed hundreds of thousands of children was finally, slowly, being dismantled. But the question that haunts the historical record is not how the system ended. It is how it lasted so long. The answer lies in the numbers. In 1851, at the height of the Victorian era, there were nearly 2 million children under 15 in the British workforce. That was not a fringe phenomenon. It was the mainstream. The average working-class child spent more hours in a factory or a mine or a chimney than they spent sleeping, eating, or playing combined. They grew up knowing nothing else. They married other factory children. They raised children who went into the same mills. And across several decades, the industrial economy of the most powerful nation on earth rested on their small, scarred, exhausted bodies. When the factory inspectors finally arrived in force, when the laws finally took effect, when the school boards finally compelled attendance, the children did not thank anyone. They did not hold parades. They did not write memoirs. They simply vanished from the historical record, replaced in the official statistics by the next generation, and the next, until childhood itself was reinvented as a time for education rather than labor. But the chimneys they climbed, the tunnels they crawled, the looms they tended, those structures still stand. And if you walk through the industrial towns of northern England today, past the converted mills that are now luxury apartments, past the coal mines that are now museums, past the chimney stacks that are now heritage landmarks, you can still feel the scale of what was demanded from children who had no choice but to give it. The Victorian child labour system was not a crime committed by a few bad men. It was a system built by an entire society that valued production over protection, profit over people, and the present over the future. And the brutal reality is that it worked, in the narrowest economic sense. It worked so well that it took nearly a century of activism, legislation, and enforcement to undo it. And even then, it was not compassion that finally ended it. It was compulsory education which turned children from wage earners into students, and the rising political power of the working class which turned voters into reformers. Isabella Reed, the 12-year-old trapper sitting alone in the dark mine, grew up. She left the pits. She married. She had children. And those children never went underground because by the time they came of age, the law had finally caught up with the reality that Isabella had lived every day of her childhood. She was not a hero. She was not a symbol. She was a child who worked because she had to, in a world that did not yet believe that childhood was worth protecting. And if you listen closely to the historical record past the parliamentary debates and the factory inspectors' reports and the Royal Commission testimonies, you can still hear her voice, and 100,000 others like hers, asking not for pity, but simply to be remembered as what they were. Not statistics, not collateral damage, just children. Children who worked,